Well, hello everyone, and welcome again to this lunch webinar on interdisciplinary science at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And I am Professor Emerita Tuija Hilding Rydevik at the Swedish Biodiversity Center in SLU. And I also have a background in interdisciplinary science. And I'm a natural scientist by training, but my professorship and all my research is in social science. And I replace today Professor Marie Stensäcke, that is the ordinary chair of these webinars. But now to the main issue. And we today are really happy to have Professor Erik Andersson from University of Helsinki and the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University to give a talk with the headline Inter and Transdisciplinary Practice, Designing Processes for Joint Learning and Exchange. And he is invited due to his long-grounded experience as a leader of several international and interdisciplinary research projects in the field of natural resource management, including adaptation and biodiversity, and also conservation in regional development, co-creation, and dialogue for collective action, mixed methods development, and urban sustainability. So, very welcome. And the timetable is that we give the floor to Erik for around 20 to 30 minutes until around 12:45, and then there will be an open floor for questions, and we will end by 12:55. So, with no further ado, I give the floor to Erik. Please, you can start.
Thank you. So I hope with that everyone can see my screen. So I want to start with, I've split this presentation. It's not very much time. Inter and transdisciplinary is a complicated issue and something worth a lot of thought and plenty of discussions. But I thought I'd start my presentation with why I think inter and transdisciplinary science is needed. And this has to do with the questions that many of us are interested in asking and ways of trying to find out the answers to them. And then I'll move on to what was maybe more indicated by the title, how to think about designing processes into or transdisciplinary processes for trying to tackle the problems we set up. So with that, I'll get us started. So there's, of course, you can spend plenty of time just trying to decide on or talk through just what multi, inter, and transdisciplinary science is, what the differences are, or if it's all just part of the same cluster of things or variations on the same theme. But I'd like to make a distinction because I like to think of myself as both an inter and a transdisciplinarian, and I see a difference between the two. So even if they are joint knowledge processes, joint learning processes, there's a bit of a difference in terms of how you can think about the contract we set up and also the terms for collaboration, where the interdisciplinary, the academic or intra-academic interest in science and ways of understanding things is a bit different from the real world transdisciplinary science, that although it has to be grounded in science, is also something that has to align with a number of other processes a bit, even more different than different disciplinary traditions. So there is a difference in what questions we ask. At least I use transdisciplinary approaches to ask more action-oriented questions about real-world problems, things that are very much in need of knowledge input or are looking for solutions. While the interdisciplinary I use more as an open license to ask any question I'm interested in, any scientific question. And they, again, not having to conform with some of the realities of the non-academic world. Interdisciplinarity is perhaps a bit more abstract, but also freer in what it allows me to do. I think of inter and transdisciplinary science and the knowledge they produce in terms of epistemic communities. So there's definitely different ways of producing knowledge and different types of knowledges, but we should also recognize the different practices. So I've become more interested of late in not just understanding different perspectives or different ways of understanding, but really how we try to engage with and produce those ways of understanding. So with that as a background, I'll move us on to how I've started to develop a mixed practice of using inter and transdisciplinary methods to do research on various different phenomena and topics, and also to observe and reflect on the process itself to try to learn something and learn in a more systematic way about how to do inter and transdisciplinary research. And then also, of course, to evaluate the science that comes out of it. So I've always understood myself as primarily interested in applied science. My professorship is in sustainable development, and that is very much the kind of questions I'm trying to tackle. So while I'm interested in real-world phenomena and the different ways of understanding or looking at them, I'm also interested in how we try to engage with them, how we try to make sense of them, and how we try to solve them if they are or could be understood as problems. I was steeped in and have always used a systems perspective. And this can be easily confused with more of a helicopter perspective of looking at everything from above and giving everything equal weight and conflating real-world complexities into simple system models, which is not what I'm trying to do. So I've approached systems science and systems thinking from a different perspective, trying to find ways of aggregating and connecting different pieces of knowledge to start with very limited understandings, but expand them and try to apply knowledge produced within a certain context to other contexts, to other issues beyond its original conception. So what I'm trying to develop is more of a way of better contextualizing research, connecting results, and by making these bridges between different ways of understanding, making sense of problems, slowly build up a systemic understanding. And here, of course, the different perspectives can be understood in different ways. So sometimes we want them, or we want to integrate perspectives to build on or use additional methods, additional thinking and theory to build on something that we've already investigated. And sometimes we want them instead for contrast and to allow us to ask critical questions about results and insights, just to test whether or not we feel that they are robust. I've also spent a lot of time trying to do comparison beyond your regular standardized way of thinking comparison. How do we compare things that are inherently different? Which is something I started when I did work together with a colleague back in the days on integrated valuation, looking at the value of biodiversity from different perspectives. If you follow IPBES now, you know that there has been a lot of focus on values and the need to shift from an economic discourse to make more space for and give more weight to alternative ways of appreciating and valuing biodiversity. And what that discussion led to was that my colleague and I, we discussed whether or not you actually want to combine different values, or if sometimes they are better used in parallel. So to question and challenge each other rather than to find the ultimate weighted, balanced way of looking at things, which is a perspective I'm trying to apply also on issues well beyond just valuation of anything, biodiversity, for example, but also to think about science and how to connect perspectives and try to address various complex, often wicked problems. So how do we make connections? There are a couple of different ways. A more conventional is perhaps to think about standardizing methods to look for similar data, same kind of data. But that's certainly not the only way. We can also use theoretical bridges, things that are trying to explain the same phenomena, or at least look at the same type of processes. Need not necessarily be theories we want to integrate, but we can also think about meta-theoretical constructs, how to cobble together theories from different fields to see where they connect, how they could possibly complement each other. So that's more this interdisciplinary side, but when we get to transdisciplinary work, there's also the application and evaluation. Even if you produce insights or results that you feel have nothing to do with each other, people will or could potentially see them as connected or as part of the same discussion, regardless of how we might look at them from a theoretical or scientific perspective. And by making these connections, we still have to deal with them or try to address them in the same discussion and find ways of weighing or relating them to each other. I should also say that I've always liked abduction as a way of thinking science. So if you're not too familiar with the term, it is what sits between inductive and deductive science, where you start with an idea of what you're studying, but you're not stuck with or wedded to specific hypothesis or only answering hypothesis, but rather leave the exact interpretation and the application of the results or the implications of the results a bit open-ended. I've come to mix quantitative and qualitative methods, and I started out perhaps a bit more on the quantitative side, but in these days I can't do without my qualitative methods. I don't trust my quantitative results if I'm not allowed to question or criticize them. So there is always something left to be done after you have your results and your answers. You can expand your discussion, the way you try to make sense of them, the way you want to look at or try to apply your findings to other situations, other circumstances, which is something I at least preach to my students, that they're never fully done with the studies of when they believe they have all the theory, all the background. There's still a need, or at least it still makes sense to go back to the literature and expand and try to expand on your findings and the insights after a study has been formally concluded in terms of all the data having been analyzed. Which means you always have something to do, for good or bad. So that was something on my scientific perspective, how I try to address and ask questions. Now, a note on how I've thought about engagement. So now we're moving into how to make this happen, because I'm a great believer in group thinking. So inter and transdisciplinary science, it can obviously not be done by individuals. We need multiple different perspectives and multiple different expertise to allow us to ask in-depth questions about real world complex problems. But just how we approach questions and who you ask the questions and who's part of answering them, that can vary a bit. I've often used, and this is both for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work, and also, as you can see, it's not always the science side, but it can also be about communication. I've used often more than 3, but at least in general 3 different tiers of engagement, starting with the close collaboration, the people who are really interested in the methods, the approaches, the questions. who want to be part of the full scientific exploration, the people who want to be involved in co-production of a study and its results, which in my case has often meant an active continuous deliberation and a deliberation of both how and what you do. But then there is also a lighter version of that, the consultation, when you ask and get feedback from other groups. So it's not necessarily involving other people in the formulation of questions, but asking questions to others and get their help in answering them. And then there's the more standardized communication, which is, of course, something we recognize as in need of packaging relative to the target audiences. And also be specific in its format to speak to specific discourses or ways of packaging knowledge. And having worked as an intern transdisciplinarian for many years, I've also had various different roles, and many of them not necessarily traditionally understood as perhaps a researcher role, but I've been the instigator of various different processes, often open-ended questions, but sometimes a bit more action-oriented, although I don't feel that that is necessarily something that I, as a researcher, am best placed to do. I've facilitated any number of different dialogues and research processes, inter and transdisciplinary processes. I am a listener, which I'll get back to, because I think that one of the core principles for good inter and transdisciplinary work is being able to listen to others, which we're not as good at as we may think. I've been a broker of knowledge, trying to connect and move insights and ideas from different fields to others to see where they land and how they could situate themselves in a different discourse, which is also very much about translation. We need, more often than we may think, translate our knowledge. It's just repeating it to different audiences using the same language, the same way of speaking about things will not work. It needs to be translated to fit into different knowledge systems or ways of trying to make sense of problems and their potential solutions. I am a synthesizer. I connect things, and I also serve as an expert, and this is more often a role I take in other people's processes, because I feel that if I invite and ask people to join my explorations, I owe them to some extent to also help out and be part of their processes, because there is something maybe not often recognized, especially for transdisciplinary science, that there is a need for aligning processes. And this goes to very different practices. So we live in different rationales, different employers, different organizations have very different expectations of or on what we do with our time, and how processes, be that planning processes, research processes, how they are supposed, or what they're supposed to look like. And aligning these and make sure that you find a format, especially for transdisciplinary work, that fits all the participants is very important, and something I invest a lot of time in, just to make sure that these processes actually have something to offer to everyone involved, not just me and my research interests. And I've also spent increasingly much effort and time on monitoring and evaluating process outcomes, both in terms of the actual knowledge output, but also in terms of performance, learning, and so forth. So with all that said, what does this look like? What is my everyday practice? So I thought I'd provide you with a couple of project examples where we've worked with different ways of knowing, different ways of making sense of things. With also a touch on what I see as the practice of the science I do. So not just the theory of it, but the practice. So from one of my projects, or many projects, but one current project, what we're doing there, this is a case-based research design. And it is research framed by one conceptual framework that is meant to be inclusive enough that you can do a lot of different things. Within it, it's on conservation, biodiversity conservation in complex urban, peri-urban landscapes, where we look at anything from the ecological character and dynamics of the landscapes to individual relations people have with nature, to protected areas, to more institutional aspects of how governance is shaped around conservation issues, where we have a number of international case studies. And all of them started with very specific questions, usually sitting somewhere in something with fewer disciplines. In it, at least, either focusing on individual connections to nature or organizational, institutional issues or ecological issues. But where the idea is that each case, or regardless of where it starts, will expand and try to add layers and more questions to that original investigation, and over time start to, if not necessarily converge on how they did things, but at least start to overlap in what questions they've asked and how they try to understand and situate conservation in different landscapes. So this is a good example of this aggregative way of looking at how to build a systemic understanding. You start to add or expand your contextualization of your results until this expansion start to overlap between different questions of different fields. In this case, it was cases, but it's also disciplinary or specific perspectives on the main research questions we're asking. From another project, and this is more how we've tried to stage and set up knowledge co-creation processes. You are more than familiar with the current hype around co-production, co-creation, co-various, I'm sure. Loved by the EU and also much used in interdisciplinary science, sustainability science, but not always that carefully described in what it does and in what ways this can be understood as robust ways of knowing. So there is a line of research thinking about multiple evidence and how we give weight to different ways of understanding and making sense of the world. A tradition that we're building on and this is in another project where we've looked at together with various different local to regional stakeholders, how we can think about climate adaptation and this set in a multifunctional landscape where people have various different stakes and interests, but all of them concerned with water and water shortage issues. So that's more the general background. But what we were interested in was how do we design a co-production process that will lead to actionable knowledge and improved, at least perceived, agency by the people involved. And this is recognizing the people involved as being embedded in very different organizations and structures. So what enable one person is not necessarily the same as would enable someone else. So this is more methods development, where we created a 3-step workshop series and tried to be very specific with what knowledge we thought was needed to allow you to ask questions and also find ways of engaging differently with water management and water governance in your system. And then to track how our knowledge co-production design allowed these things to emerge, how it helped articulate and translate different knowledge, different perspectives, how it helped surface and connect differences and similarities between how actors understood both the problem and their options for trying to engage with or do something about the problem. And key to these processes, so this is from yet another project where we focused on more the individual practice and not so much about the process design, but how do you engage as a participant? Because you tend to, at least I tend to end up participating in my own processes as a facilitator, as a participator, sometimes only as the process owner, but a bit too often in a mixed slightly, at least to me, unclear. I try to be clear to everyone, or clear with everyone, just what my role is, but that often does become a bit muddled. But this is more an individual practice of, here we looked at listening and what could be understood as good listening, as a weak method, as something that is sufficiently clear and helpful in terms of offering guidance, but not too rigid or set in what it prescribes. So it's something meant to be applicable to many different situations, where we drew on a very broad interdisciplinary literature on how listening has been understood from different disciplinary perspectives, and then tried to tweak these different understandings into something that spoke to inter and transdisciplinary processes. And I'm sure that no one would be too surprised by what we came up with, but still it is a way of structuring and trying to emphasize the qualities of good listening. And again, I have struggled to see a number of inter and transdisciplinary collaborations where people aren't really interested in the inter and transdisciplinary collaboration. They are there for various slightly unknown reasons. This is also to emphasize that listening and being interested in what someone else has to say and trying actively to make sense of what someone says to you. So hearing is not, well, listening is not the same as hearing. Hearing is just passively receiving things, but listening is an active process. And here we focused on how you can listen and try to make sense of what people are trying to tell you as part of an interdisciplinary practice. Something we played with in a paper just to show how, depending on what you aim for, a fully integrated, fully shared understanding of at least your differences, if not necessarily a problem itself, or different, or producing different specific understandings, how you could think about the demands or the level of good listening required for these different outcomes. Back to the process design. So here's just to provide you with a bit more content. So what we were trying to do here was to support collective action, not necessarily lead collective action. That's also something I don't feel is quite something I should do, but more for the other people involved in the process, where we wanted to bring out and connect different ways of understanding option space with a systems knowledge, a systems understanding of problems, where climate change is taking us, other issues around land use and the different values and functions related to cultural landscapes. Together with target knowledge of better understanding and ideally also empathizing with other people and their way of seeing the world and trying to live in it, with operational knowledge, which is more about understanding opportunity space, understanding the processes, understanding governance and how to engage with it, where the process was about mobilizing and articulating individual knowledge within these three spheres held by different actors, and help translate these insights to something that could be understood by all other participants, and finally connect it into something that could be understood as the collective version of the same knowledge, something hopefully more supportive of collective action. And with that, so this is one of the last slides, but I should say that also what I've been careful with is this, with when assuming different roles, also to have a discussion, see out the processes of just what the different roles are and how they change over time. Because with this process, we as researchers and process facilitators, and to some extent process owners, although it was co-owned together with some of the stakeholders, we made it very clear when we started that we would only take it to a certain point at which we would step back, not necessarily step away. So we would still be involved, but we would not lead any work towards action. So once we had produced or got the understanding and the knowledge to a certain level and the shared understanding to a certain level, we would rather pass on the leadership to the other participants. Basically, anyone who would want to move forward with this knowledge to try to actually do something about the situation. And this, I think, is important. Quite often, research tend to come in and disappear from local circumstances, which I don't like. I've done it a couple of times for various reasons, funding and other realities, but I still don't like it. So if you can be more transparent and find ways of continuing to support a process beyond the research interest, or where the research has the lead, is, to me at least, very important. And then to final slides, I've also started to more actively use a reflexive approach to my research. This is a way of adding additional layers of interpretation, understanding to you, and also a way of trying to monitor and evaluate how things landed, whether they turned out as you thought they did. And reflexivity can be anything from just thinking through what went well to a more scientific structured approach to monitoring and evaluating knowledge outcomes, learning, and so forth. So this is just to give you one example of something we did in a project where we try to track different questions around learning, why learn, what to learn about, who to learn with, how to learn, when to learn. So this was from a loosely designed and organized process of collaboration, but when much of the collaboration emerged rather than was something that we created intentionally. So we wanted to better evaluate afterward what had happened and how did we end up where we did. So this was a way of trying to track and make sense of the kind of different engagement and the different learning processes that had taken place throughout the project, and then track better who had learned what through these different engagement. And this is something that I'm currently working on, trying to expand my reflexive toolbox, as it were, to find ways of better capturing and also make more transparent what it is we do when we reflect. You may have seen it in papers, people saying that they use a reflexive approach or whatever, but if we can't explain and we can't make it transparent, and this is the same as with synthesis or other interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary pursuits, if we can't make them transparent and convey what we do and in what ways we feel that they are scientific rigorous, then I don't think that people not interested in these more systemic ways of doing things will be convinced. So that was very short, possibly not fully comprehensible, but nevertheless just a pick from activities from various different projects. So a nod to some of them here on the site. You can find them and more information about them. Would you be interested? And I will leave it at that and see if there are questions.